My name is Chloe, and I am 31 years old. I always knew marrying into Atlanta high society would come with a price, but I never expected the cost to be my independence, my dignity, and my $2 million penthouse. During what was supposed to be a celebratory dinner at my future in-law's opulent Buckhead estate, my future father-in-law slid a contract across the antique mahogany table. He demanded that I transfer the title of my newly purchased, fully paid-off apartment to his son before our wedding day. I simply smiled, looked him dead in the eye, and calmly said one word: no. The illusion of my perfect fiancé shattered instantly. He flew into a terrifying rage, storming across the room to lock the heavy dining room doors, trapping me inside. He shouted in my face, attempting to intimidate me into signing away the only true home I had ever known. They sat there with smug, expectant faces, absolutely certain that a girl with my background would fold under their combined power. Instead, I calmly unzipped my handbag and pulled out a thick folder of documents. In that very moment, all the screaming stopped, and the entire room fell into a complete, suffocating silence. To understand how we reached this point of absolute madness, you have to understand the family I was marrying into. Julian was the vice president of his family investment fund, a man who seemed to represent the pinnacle of Black excellence. His father, Jeremiah, was a heavyweight real estate mogul and a prominent elder at one of the largest megachurches in Atlanta. His mother, Vivian, was a legacy socialite, a woman whose entire existence revolved around charity galas, exclusive country clubs, and maintaining the flawless image of their family dynasty. They were old money, or at least they projected the illusion of it flawlessly to the outside world. I, on the other hand, was the absolute definition of new money. I did not grow up summering in Martha's Vineyard, and my parents were certainly not part of the exclusive Jack and Jill networks. I clawed my way up from the absolute bottom to build one of the most ruthless and successful crisis management and public relations firms in the Southeast. I handled massive scandals for politicians, high-profile celebrities, and corrupt corporate executives. I made my own fortune through sleepless nights, and I used it to buy my dream penthouse outright. There was no mortgage, no CO signers, just my name on the deed of a breathtaking property overlooking the city skyline. The dinner was supposed to be a peaceful final celebration before our wedding rehearsal later that week. The dining room was intimidating by design, featuring a massive crystal chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over the fine china and impossibly expensive silverware. The conversation was the usual exhausting mix of name-dropping and subtle boasting until the dessert plates were quietly cleared away by their private chef. Jeremiah leaned back in his tufted leather chair, steepled his fingers together with a calculated slowness, and nodded significantly at Julian. Julian reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and slid it across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of my plate. I looked down at the unexpected item, then up at Julian, waiting patiently for an explanation. "Open it," Julian said, his voice carrying that smooth, practiced charm he always used in high-stakes boardrooms. "It is just some standard pre-wedding paperwork my father and I had the lawyers draw up to ensure everything is perfectly organized for our future." I pulled the documents out of the envelope. It only took a few seconds of scanning the dense, complicated legal jargon to realize exactly what I was looking at. It was a formal deed transfer, a legally binding contract relinquishing my sole ownership of my penthouse and transferring the title entirely into Julian's name without a single cent of compensation. I looked at Jeremiah, keeping my face perfectly composed so as not to betray the electric shock currently pulsing through my veins. "What is this, Jeremiah?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly steady and meticulously professional. Jeremiah offered a patronizing smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Chloe, you are marrying into a legacy. In our family, the man is the head of the household, and that means he manages all the major assets. It is a matter of tradition and divine order. A wife submitting her property to her husband, protection is the very foundation of a strong, unified marriage. We simply cannot have separate empires competing under one single roof." Vivian took a delicate sip of her expensive red wine, her eyes glittering with thinly veiled disdain. She had never liked me, always viewing my self-made status as something vulgar compared to their inherited generational prestige. "You have to understand, Chloe," Vivian chimed in, her tone dripping with heavy condescension. You did not come from our world. Your background is commendable, really, but it fundamentally lacks the structural understanding of how true dynasties operate. We are generously allowing you to join a very prestigious lineage. Providing the deed to your apartment is simply a basic demonstration of your trust and commitment to our family way of doing things. You should be immensely grateful Julian is willing to take on the heavy burden of managing your complicated financial affairs. I looked back down at the printed contract resting innocently next to my water glass. They were essentially asking me to pay a massive multi-million-dollar entry fee to join their family, using the single greatest asset I had worked 80-hour weeks for years to acquire. They saw my professional success not as a brilliant achievement to be respected, but as an unearned prize that needed to be surrendered to the men in the room to maintain their fragile egos. I slid the documents back into the manila envelope and placed it neatly out of my way. I looked at Julian, waiting to see if the man I was supposed to marry would defend me against this blatant extortion. Instead, he just reached across the table and handed me a heavy silver pen. "Sign it, Chloe." Julian urged, his handsome smile tightening noticeably at the edges. "It is just a formality. We are going to be one family anyway, so what does it matter whose name is officially on the meaningless paperwork?" I folded my hands gracefully in my lap, offered them a polite, chilling smile, and delivered my final answer. "No." The single word hung in the air, sharp and absolute. The reaction was instantaneous and incredibly violent. Julian's charming mask dissolved, completely replaced by a dark contortion of pure, unadulterated fury. His heavy dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as he leapt to his feet, knocking over his wineglass in the process. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded, his voice dropping a full octave into a menacing, unfamiliar growl. "I said no," I repeated, maintaining my calm demeanor despite the fierce adrenaline flooding my system. "I am not signing over my home to you or anyone else." Julian marched aggressively across the large room and slammed the heavy oak dining room doors shut, turning the brass lock with a loud final click. He turned back to face me, his chest heaving rapidly, his eyes wild with a dangerous anger I had never witnessed before in all our years of dating. He marched back to the table, looming over me, physically trapping me between my chair and the hard edge of the mahogany table. "You are not going to disrespect my father in his own house," Julian screamed, a thick vein bulging visibly in his neck. "You are going to pick up that silver pen and you are going to sign that paper right now. Who do you think you are? You think because you run some little public relations firm, you can sit at this table and dictate terms to us. You are embarrassing me, Chloe. You are going to sign this right now or there will not be a wedding at all. I will ruin you." Jeremiah and Vivian sat back comfortably in their chairs, watching the terrifying spectacle with quiet approval. They were happily letting Julian act as their physical enforcer, fully expecting me to cower, to cry, to beg for their forgiveness, and frantically sign the papers just to calm him down. They thought my composure was just a fragile shell that would inevitably crack under the immense pressure of their collective intimidation. They vastly underestimated what I do for a living. I am a crisis manager. I dismantle arrogant, powerful men before breakfast. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I slowly stood up, pushing my chair back firmly against Julian's legs to force him to step away from my personal space. I picked up my designer handbag from the floor, unzipped it smoothly, and pulled out a thick red folder of my own. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the silent room. "You want to talk about assets?" I asked, my voice slicing through the thick tension like a surgical scalpel. "Let us talk about yours, or rather the complete and utter lack thereof." Julian stared at the red folder, momentarily thrown off balance by my complete lack of fear. "What is that?" He spat, his unearned confidence wavering slightly. "That is a comprehensive forensic background check on your family investment fund and your father's legendary real estate empire," I explained calmly. "You see, when a family as obsessed with status as yours suddenly demands a $2 million fully paid-off asset from an outsider, it raises immediate glaring red flags. So I had my team do some deep digging into your public filings." Jeremiah's face turned a dangerous shade of purple as I continued my presentation. "Your empire is a crumbling house of cards, Jeremiah," I said, looking directly at the patriarch. You are drowning in massive debt. Your flagship commercial properties are bleeding money, and you are over-leveraged by tens of millions of dollars. You are facing imminent defaults on 3 different construction loans by the end of this quarter alone. I turned to Vivian, whose wine glass was now shaking violently in her trembling hand. And Vivian, those expensive charity galas you love hosting to show off your wealth. My team found out the family foundation has been quietly funneling money to cover the enormous interest payments on Julian personal undisclosed lines of credit. I looked back at Julian, who had gone completely pale. You do not want my penthouse to protect your family legacy. You desperately need my unencumbered debt-free property to use as fresh collateral to secure a desperate bridge loan to save yourselves from absolute bankruptcy. You need my hard-earned money to keep the lights on in this ridiculous oversized mansion. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The grand, powerful family had been stripped entirely naked, their darkest, most humiliating financial secrets laid bare on their own dining table for me to see. I picked up my purse and walked gracefully over to the locked oak doors. Julian was far too stunned to stop me. I turned the heavy brass lock, opened the door wide, and looked back at the 3 of them one last time. You really thought you could trap me in here and bully me into signing away my life work? I smiled a genuine predatory smile. I am the one who successfully manages crises. You are just the crisis. Oh, and by the way, I have already sent a copy of that entire red folder to the senior council at your church, Jeremiah. I am absolutely sure they will love knowing exactly how their esteemed elder handles his personal and corporate finances. I walked out of the silent mansion, my heels clicking rhythmically against the expensive marble floors. I did not look back. I stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night, the adrenaline singing loudly in my veins. I got into my car, locked the doors, and let out a long, shaky breath. I had survived the aggressive ambush, but I knew deep down this was only the very beginning of the war. Just as I put the luxury car in drive, my phone buzzed brightly in the cup holder. It was an automated text message from my bank. I picked it up, my eyes narrowing sharply as I read the red alert flashing on the screen. Alert. Your corporate credit line has just been frozen due to suspicious activity. Please contact your financial institution immediately. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark car. The battle lines were officially drawn, and they had just launched their first devastating retaliation against my livelihood. I knew exactly what this meant. Vivian and Jeremiah were not just angry, they were deeply connected, possessing the kind of ruthless influence that could silence anyone who dared to challenge their supremacy. They intended to cut off my financial oxygen to starve my business until I came crawling back to them on my knees begging for their mercy. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. I was not a fragile socialite playing business. I was a hardened survivor. The next morning, the Atlanta sun felt unforgiving as it glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Buckhead office. I stood staring out at the skyline, a cup of black coffee cooling in my hands. The frozen corporate credit line was a tactical strike, but I knew Jeremiah and Vivian well enough to know it was only their opening salvo. They were trying to suffocate me to force a swift capitulation before the reality of their bankruptcy could leak to their precious social circle. I turned back to my desk and opened my personal laptop. If they were willing to freeze my business accounts, I needed to secure my personal assets immediately. I logged into the joint wedding fund account Julian and I had established 6 months prior. We had each contributed exactly $100,000, bringing the total to a solid $200,000 intended for vendors' deposits and the exorbitant venue fees Vivian had insisted upon. The screen loaded and the bold red numbers practically screamed at me. Account balance $0. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen as if the numbers might magically rearrange themselves. A quick scan of the transaction history confirmed my worst fears. At exactly 3 o'clock that morning, just hours after I had walked out of his family dining room, Julian had authorized a complete wire transfer of the entire $200,000 into a private offshore account solely in his name. He had not just tried to steal my penthouse. He had successfully robbed me of $100,000 of my own hard-earned cash. A cold, hard fury settled into my chest, replacing the lingering shock of the previous night. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian's personal number. He answered on the second ring, his voice oozing with a sickeningly triumphant satisfaction. Good morning, my beautiful, stubborn fiancé Julian practically purred into the receiver. I trust you slept well. You emptied the joint account, I stated, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. $200,000, Julian. That is grand larceny. Julian chuckled, a dark, condescending sound that made my skin crawl. Do not be so dramatic, Chloe. It is not stealing. It is simply safekeeping. Consider it an administrative hold until you learn how to be a submissive, cooperative wife. Once you sign the deed to the penthouse over to me, the wedding funds will magically reappear and we can move forward with our beautiful life together. You cannot possibly believe I'm going to marry you now, I replied, gripping the edge of my desk. Not after you ambushed me, locked me in a room, and tried to extort me for a $2 million property. Oh, you will marry me, Chloe, Julian sneered, dropping the charming facade entirely. Because if you cancel this wedding, I will absolutely ruin your business reputation in this city. I will personally ensure that every major corporate client you have drops you by the end of the week. You think you are untouchable because you fix scandals. Let us see how well you handle being the center of one. I ended the call without another word. Engaging with a narcissist when they feel powerful was a waste of breath. I needed to move fast. But before I could even begin drafting a legal response to the theft, my office phone started ringing incessantly. My executive assistant knocked urgently on my door, her face pale. Chloe, she said breathlessly, it is Vivian. She is everywhere. I quickly realized that while Julian was handling the financial extortion, Vivian had gleefully taken charge of the social warfare. My personal cell phone began blowing up with concerned, confused, and increasingly alarmed text messages from my elite clientele. Vivian had spent the entire morning systematically calling every prominent country club member, HBCU alumni board president, and high society matriarch in Atlanta. The narrative she spun was masterful in its sheer malicious creativity. According to Vivian, I was currently suffering from a severe unhinged psychiatric breakdown. I was allegedly exhibiting violent paranoid behavior, and worst of all, I was actively trying to extort her poor innocent son Julian out of millions of dollars before the wedding. She painted herself as the heartbroken, deeply concerned mother-in-law, who was desperately trying to get me the psychiatric help I so clearly needed while protecting her family prestigious legacy from my gold-digging machinations. It was a classic smear campaign designed to isolate me socially and professionally, making me look unstable so that no one would believe a word I said about their impending bankruptcy. I spent the next 3 hours engaged in grueling damage control calls with my most critical clients. I had to maintain absolute professionalism, projecting an aura of total unbothered calm, while systematically dismantling Vivian outrageous lies. I assured my clients that the rumors were entirely baseless, the unfortunate result of a sudden broken engagement due to irreconcilable financial differences. It was exhausting, meticulous work, the kind of crisis management I usually performed for others, now fiercely directed at saving my own empire. Just as I successfully managed to placate the CEO of a major logistics firm, my computer chimed with an urgent automated notification. It was an email from the Fulton County Clerk Office, an alert system I had set up years ago to monitor any legal filings against my business entities. I clicked open the email, my eyes scanning the attached digital document. The breath caught painfully in my throat. Someone had just filed a massive commercial lien against my PR firm headquarters. The document claimed an outstanding debt of over $500,000, citing unpaid consulting services rendered by a shell corporation I had never even heard of. The implications were catastrophic. A commercial lien of that magnitude would immediately freeze all my remaining business operations, trigger automatic defaults on my operational leases, and essentially bankrupt my firm within a matter of weeks. The sheer audacity of the attack was breathtaking. They were not just trying to force me to surrender my penthouse. They were actively trying to completely annihilate my entire professional existence. I zoomed in on the digital signature at the bottom of the fraudulent loan application. The signature was supposedly mine, but it was a flawless, meticulous forgery. I sat back in my leather chair, the silence of my office suddenly feeling incredibly heavy. The scope of their retaliation was staggering. Julian had stolen my cash. Vivian was destroying my social standing. And now someone in their inner circle was committing high-level corporate fraud to illegally seize my company assets. I realized with chilling clarity that I was no longer dealing with a toxic family dispute. I was dealing with a highly organized, ruthless criminal conspiracy. They were systematically dismantling every pillar of my independence, intending to leave me absolutely destitute and socially exiled until signing over the penthouse became my only option for survival. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the keypad. My first instinct was to call the police to report the stolen funds and the forged lien immediately. But a cold tactical logic stopped me. If I went to the authorities now, it would be my word against one of the most powerful, deeply entrenched families in Atlanta. They had the resources to drag the investigation out for years, while my business suffocated and died under the weight of the fraudulent lien. I needed undeniable, ironclad proof. I needed to catch them completely off guard, exposing their criminal network in a way that they could never possibly spin or deny. I needed to fight this war not in the courtroom, but on a stage where their precious reputation would be burned to ash in front of everyone they desperately wanted to impress. I opened my security software, bypassing the standard interface and diving directly into the encrypted cloud backups. If someone had filed a fraudulent lien using my company credentials, they had to have accessed my physical corporate seal, which was securely locked in my private office safe. I pulled up the security footage from the previous night, painstakingly reviewing the hours between my explosive departure from the Buckhead estate and my arrival at the office this morning. The primary security logs had clearly been tampered with, showing a continuous loop of an empty hallway. But the secondary cloud backup, which I had secretly installed specifically for scenarios like this, caught a brief critical 3-second glitch. I froze the frame, enhancing the grainy image. A figure stepped out of the blind spot, swiping a keycard to access my executive suite. The face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but the distinctive custom-tailored suit and the expensive limited edition watch were unmistakable. It was Terrence, Julian brother-in-law, the husband of his sister Sienna, and the chief financial officer of Jeremiah failing real estate empire. Terrence had personally broken into my office to steal my corporate seal and forge the catastrophic lien against my business. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. They had made a critical error. By involving Terrence, they had explicitly tied the fraudulent attack on my business directly to Jeremiah corporate structure. This was no longer just Julian acting as a spurned, vengeful fiancé. This was the entire family actively conspiring to commit corporate espionage and fraud. Before I could download the footage and formulate my next countermeasure, the intercom on my desk buzzed sharply. Chloe, my assistant, said, her voice tight with barely suppressed panic. Sienna and Terrence are in the lobby. They are demanding to see you immediately, and Sienna is causing a massive scene. She says if you do not come down to the coffee shop right now, she is going to start talking to the press. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy clarity of the moment wash over me. I told my assistant to stay at her desk, keep her head down, and instruct the rest of the staff to continue executing our standard crisis protocols. In my line of work, panic is a luxury reserved for victims. I am never the victim. Before stepping away from my desk, I immediately locked down the cloud server. I exported the raw, unedited video file of Terrence break in onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I pulled the digital metadata from the county clerk office lien filing. The IP address used to submit the forged loan application had been routed through a virtual private network registered directly to one of Jeremiah's shell corporations. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading straight back to their own front door. I printed a high-resolution still frame from the backup footage. The image clearly showed Terrence's face, his custom-tailored suit, and the stolen corporate seal held firmly in his gloved hand. I slipped the paper and one of the encrypted drives into a plain manila folder, then slid it securely into my handbag. I walked out of my executive suite and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. The high-rise lobby in Buckhead was an impressive expanse of polished marble floor-to-ceiling glass and soaring ceilings. Attached to the main atrium was an artisanal coffee shop, popular with top attorneys, venture capitalists, and local politicians. It was a primary hub for Atlanta power brokers. As the elevator doors opened, I spotted Sienna immediately. She was pacing near the glass entrance of the coffee shop, wearing a bright pastel outfit that screamed high society brunch. She was intentionally raising her voice, complaining to an awkward group of patrons about unhinged career women who take advantage of noble black families. Terrence stood beside her with his arms crossed over his chest, trying to project the imposing posture of an untouchable corporate titan. His limited edition luxury watch caught the morning light, the exact same watch I had just watched on high-definition video as he broke into my safe. I adjusted my jacket and walked toward them. My posture was straight, my expression unreadable. I did not scurry down the hallway like a frightened animal. I strode forward like the owner of the building. Sienna turned as I approached, putting on a dramatic show of deep personal betrayal for the gathering onlookers. "There she is," Sienna announced loudly, gesturing dramatically in my direction. "The woman who lied to my brother used our family name to elevate her reputation and is now trying to ruin us because she cannot handle being held accountable." Several influential people in the coffee shop turned to stare. In Buckhead's social standing is built on optics, and Sienna was attempting to use public shame to break my spirit before I could even open my mouth. I walked directly up to them, stopping less than 2 feet away. I did not raise my voice. I did not scurry into a corner. I looked Sienna up and down with calm, cold detachment. "Sienna, if you are going to put on a theatrical performance for my neighbors, at least hire a better director," I said, keeping my voice at a low, even register that forced her and Terrence to stop shouting and lean in close to hear me. Sienna's face contorted with anger. "Do not test me, Chloe," she hissed, dropping her voice into a sharp whisper. "You think you are so smart because you run this little agency. You came into our lives acting like you were better than us, ignoring our traditions and refusing to respect the family hierarchy. Julian offered you a place in an elite dynasty, and you threw it back in his face because of your disgusting, selfish ego. You mean I refused to let your father and brother rob me of $2 million to cover their illegal gambling debts and defaulted mortgages?" I replied calmly. Terrence stepped forward, attempting to use his height to loom over me. "Watch your mouth, Chloe," he warned, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are throwing around wild accusations about things you know nothing about." I turned my eyes toward Terrence and looked directly at his wrist. "That is a very distinct watch, Terrence," I noted smoothly. "It is remarkable how clearly the diamond bezel reflects light even in dark rooms, like an executive office after business hours." Terrence smirked, completely unbothered. He truly believed he was a master criminal because he had looped the primary hallway camera. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. "You can make all the cryptic comments you want," Terrence said, taking a step closer. "The reality is that your business is currently under a $500,000 commercial lion. Your corporate credit is frozen. Your reputation in this city is currently being shredded by Vivian. By the end of the week, you will not have a single client left in Georgia." Sienna reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents. She thrust them toward my chest. "This is your one and only way out, Chloe," Sienna declared, her voice dripping with artificial malice. "This is a formal settlement agreement. You will immediately sign over the deed to your penthouse to Julian. You will drop any ridiculous claims about the wedding fund. You will sign a total non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak our family name again. In exchange, Jeremiah will instruct our attorneys to lift the lien on your firm." "And if I refuse?" I asked, looking down at the crisp white paper. Terrence leaned down until his face was inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and unearned confidence. "If you refuse," Terrence whispered, "we will not just destroy your business. We will have Jeremiah call the district attorney. He sits on the board of the City Ethics Commission, Chloe. By 5 o'clock today, we will ensure that fabricated financial records are leaked to every news outlet in the state, showing that your PR firm has been laundering money for international drug cartels. You will be arrested. Your assets will be seized permanently. You will go to a federal prison, and no one in this city will ever hire you again." Sienna smiled a cruel, victorious smile. "You have until 4 o'clock today to sign those papers and deliver them to Julian at the club. Do not bother calling the police. Nobody believes an unhinged woman over Jeremiah." They turned on their heels, expecting me to collapse in tears right there on the marble floor. They walked toward the street, completely convinced that they had just delivered a fatal blow to my life. I stood in the center of the lobby, holding the manila envelope in my handbag. I looked at Terrence, retreating back then, looked down at my phone. I did not cry. I did not shake. I opened my contacts and dialed the direct line of a senior special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation who owed me a massive personal favor after I handled a high-profile crisis for his department last year. Agent Miller, I said as soon as he picked up. I have a corporate break in financial fraud and an ongoing extortion racket involving a prominent local family. I have the unedited video footage, the digital footprint, and the suspects on tape. How fast can your team meet me in my office? Give me 30 minutes. Chloe, Agent Miller replied, his tone shifting instantly into sharp federal authority. Secure your local servers and do not spook the suspects. I ended the brief call and slid the phone deep into my blazer pocket. I turned away from the lobby exit and glanced through the glass partitions of the coffee shop attached to my building. Sienna and Terrence had not left the premises. Instead, they had settled into a leather booth near the center of the bustling cafe. They were sipping iced lattes and laughing openly. They wanted to bask in their supposed victory. I took a slow breath to steady my racing heart. I walked through the glass doors. The cafe was packed with Atlanta elite corporate attorneys and wealthy socialites. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. I approached the barista counter to order a simple iced water, needing a moment to anchor my thoughts. Before I could even reach the register, Sienna spotted me. She definitely did not miss a beat. She immediately launched right into a brilliantly toxic theatrical performance. "Chloe, please come sit with us." Sienna called out, her voice artificially distressed, but loud enough to ensure every single person nearby stopped what they were doing to listen. "You do not have to hide from us. We are family." I paid for my iced water, grasped the cold condensation-slicked plastic cup, and walked slowly over to their corner booth. I did not sit down. I simply stood over them, my expression completely blank. Sienna immediately looked up at me and forcefully squeezed a pair of perfectly timed fake tears to well up in her deceitful eyes. She reached out and tried to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled it away. She sniffled loudly, answering the surrounding tables were hanging on her words. "Chloe, you are breaking my brother's heart," Sienna cried, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Julian loves you so much. We all welcomed you into our home with open arms. We overlooked your background because we thought you understood the value of building something greater than yourself. But now you are acting completely erratic. You are having a breakdown and you are tearing our prestigious family apart." I stood there, letting her spin her ridiculous web. The wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables were now openly staring and whispering behind their hands. Sienna was painting me as the crazy, unhinged woman actively destroying a noble, wealthy family. "Please, Chloe." Sienna begged, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "You know how hard it is for our people to build a lasting legacy in this country. Jeremiah spent 40 years building a prominent Black empire in Atlanta. He is a pillar of the church. He is a community leader. You cannot just selfishly hoard your resources when the family needs them to solidify our generational wealth. We have to protect our Black family legacy from the system. Signing over that penthouse is about consolidating our power to fight against a society that wants to see us fail. Why are you being so greedy? Why are you trying to ruin a good man just because your ego is bruised?" It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She was weaponizing racial solidarity and community values to justify blatant financial extortion. She was twisting my independence into a betrayal of my own people. It was highly effective on the eavesdropping crowd. I could see the judgmental glances directed at me from the older socialites. They were completely buying Sienna's performance. Terrence sat back in the booth nursing his coffee. He had a sickeningly smug smile plastered across his face. He truly believed they had completely checkmated me. He thought the fraudulent commercial lien he had filed had completely broken my spirit. He thought I was standing there in silent defeat. I looked at Sienna, crocodile tears. I looked at Terrence's arrogant grin. I looked at the crowd of influential Atlanta power brokers quietly judging me based on a fabricated narrative. In crisis management, you learn that sometimes the only way to kill a false narrative is with a sudden, shocking dose of undeniable reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her ridiculous points. I simply tightened my grip on my plastic cup. Sienna, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You have no idea what legacy means. With a swift motion, I flicked my wrist. The entire contents of my large iced water splashed directly into Sienna's perfectly contoured face. The icy water ruined her expensive makeup, soaking the front of her designer silk blouse. The entire coffee shop erupted in a collective gasp of pure shock. Several people half rose from their seats. Sienna shrieked a high-pitched, genuinely horrified sound as the freezing water dripped from her eyelashes and chin. "Are you crazy?" Sienna screamed, dropping the victim act entirely and slamming her hands on the table. Terrence jumped up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. "What is wrong with you?" he yelled, stepping aggressively toward me. I did not retreat a single inch. I leaned in close, bridging the gap, until my face was only inches from Terrence. I lowered my voice to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper that only the two of them could hear over the commotion of the cafe. "I know exactly what you did at 2 o'clock this morning, Terrence," I whispered, my eyes boring directly into his soul. "I know you bypassed my security system. I know you broke into my private wall safe. I know you stole my official corporate seal, and I know you used it to forge a fraudulent $500,000 commercial lie-in against my public relations firm." Terrence's aggressive posture faltered for a fraction of a second. The smug smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden flash of genuine panic. Sienna froze mid-wipe, her soaked handkerchief pausing against her cheek as my words registered. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with sudden terror. They both realized simultaneously that their flawless corporate sabotage was completely compromised. But Terrence was a seasoned corporate predator. The panic in his eyes vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He wiped a few stray drops of water from his own suit jacket and slowly leaned back in. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, even wider and more menacing than before. "You are bluffing, Chloe," Terrence whispered back, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You cannot prove a single thing. I have the security logs," I replied, my voice unwavering. Terrence chuckled, a low, dark sound that sent a sudden, involuntary chill down my spine. "No, you do not, Chloe. Because your primary hallway cameras were caught in a diagnostic loop, and the biometric scanner on your executive suite doors was not hacked or forced open. It was bypassed using an authorized master passcode." He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "The system registered a completely legitimate entry," he gloated. "The encrypted signature on the loan application came from your own network. You cannot prove it was me because the digital footprint says you authorized the entry yourself. You have zero evidence linking me to that safe." I stared at him, my mind racing to process this new devastating information. Terrence was right about the biometric bypass. My executive suite utilized a state-of-the-art military-grade security lock. A physical break-in would have triggered a massive silent alarm straight to the local precinct. The only possible way Terrence could have accessed my private office without triggering the entire security grid was if someone had voluntarily given him the administrative override codes. But that was impossible. I was the only person who had the administrative master codes. Me and one other highly trusted individual. A sickening wave of realization crashed over me, hitting me harder than any of the financial threats they had made so far. My breath hitched painfully in my chest as the terrible pieces clicked into place. Terrence saw the exact moment the truth dawned on me. His smile grew into a full predatory grin. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. "You build these massive walls to protect your little empire." Chloe, Terrence whispered, his words cutting deeper than any knife. "But you forgot to protect yourself from the people you invited inside. Did you really think we would launch a strike this big without having eyes and ears inside your own camp? We did not have to hack your life, Chloe. We just had to pay the right person to hand us the keys." I felt the floor drop from underneath me. "No," I breathed out, unable to stop the single word of denial. "Oh yes," Terrence mocked, his eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. "You should really check on your executive assistant, Chloe. Your sweet, loyal cousin Jasmine sends her absolute best regards." The elevator ride up to my executive suite felt like the longest 2 minutes of my life. I stared at the brushed steel doors, my reflection staring back at me. My face was a mask of perfect composure, but beneath my tailored blazer, my heart was pounding a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs. Jasmine, my own flesh and blood. the cousin I had practically raised, the girl whose tuition at Clark Atlanta University I had paid in full when her father walked out. I had brought her into my firm, given her a six-figure salary, and trusted her with the keys to my kingdom. And she had sold me to the wolves. The elevator chimed cheerfully, announcing my arrival at the top floor. I stepped out into the sleek, modern reception area of my firm. The space was a testament to everything I had built, featuring imported marble floors, custom art installations, and floor-to-ceiling windows, showcasing the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Jasmine was sitting at her custom mahogany desk, typing rapidly on her computer. She looked up as I approached, flashing that bright, innocent smile that had fooled me for my entire life. "Good morning, Chloe," Jasmine chirped, her voice a perfect imitation of professional efficiency. "You had a few calls from clients regarding the Vivian situation, but I diverted them to the senior crisis team just like you asked. How did the coffee run go?" I did not say a word. I walked directly up to her desk, my heels silent on the plush designer rug. I reached into my handbag, pulled out the high-resolution printed still frame from the backup security footage, and placed it face up right on top of her keyboard. Jasmine looked down. The smile instantly melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The image clearly showed Terrence standing in my private office, holding my corporate seal, bathed in the glow of the open safe. I watched the color drain completely from my cousin's face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing, as she desperately searched for a lie that could possibly explain away the undeniable truth. "Chloe, I can explain," Jasmine stammered, her hands trembling so violently she knocked a pen off her desk. "It is not what it looks like. Terrence told me he just needed to retrieve a wedding document for Julian. I swear I did not know he was going to steal anything." I rested both my hands flat on her desk, leaning in close so my voice would not carry to the rest of the staff in the bullpen. "Do not insult my intelligence, Jasmine." I said, my tone completely flat and devoid of any warmth. "You gave him my biometric override code. That is a level 10 security breach. You bypassed a federal-grade firewall to let a predator into my sanctuary. I know exactly what happened. What I want to know right now is exactly how much my own blood sold me out for." Jasmine burst into heavy theatrical tears, burying her face in her hands. She tried to reach across the desk to grab my arm, but I stepped back, disgusted by her touch. "Julian approached me last month," Jasmine sobbed, her voice cracking. "He said you were getting too arrogant. He said you needed to be humbled before the wedding so you would understand your place in his family hierarchy. He promised me a vice president position at their family investment fund, a corner office, Chloe, a $250,000 salary. He said if I just helped them teach you a little lesson, my entire future would be set. I am so sorry. I was just so tired of being your shadow." I stared at her, absorbing the absolute pathetic reality of her betrayal. She had jeopardized my entire corporate empire, the very company that put food on her table, for a phantom job at a bankrupt company. She sold my life to a narcissist simply because she resented my success. I did not yell. I did not scream or flip the desk. In crisis management, explosive emotion is a fatal liability. Complete surgical detachment is the ultimate weapon. "You have exactly 2 minutes to pack your personal belongings," I stated, checking my watch. Jasmine looked up, her tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief. "What? Chloe, please. We are family. You cannot just throw me out on the street. Black families are supposed to stick together. You know my mother is sick. You know I need this job to pay her medical bills. Please, I will do anything to fix this." I pressed the intercom button on the desk. "Security, please send 2 guards to the executive reception immediately." I looked back at Jasmine, my eyes completely cold. "Do not you dare weaponize our family against me after what you just did. You did not think about your sick mother when you handed my corporate seal to Terrence. You did not think about Black family unity when you helped Julian try to steal my $2 million penthouse. You sold your soul for a fake job at a company that is currently defaulting on tens of millions of dollars in loans. You are not my family anymore. You are a security threat." The heavy glass doors of the reception area swung open and 2 broad-shouldered security guards stepped inside. "Escort this woman off the premises," I instructed the guards, my voice echoing clearly across the now silent office. "She is permanently banned from this building. Confiscate her keycard, her company phone, and her laptop." If she attempts to contact any of our clients or access our servers, contact the authorities immediately. Jasmine wailed, sobbing hysterically as the guards flanked her. She gathered her purse with shaking hands, crying out my name, begging for a second chance as they marched her toward the elevators. The entire office staff watched in stunned silence as my cousin, my former right hand, was forcefully removed from the empire she had tried to help destroy. I walked into my private office and locked the door behind me. The silence was absolute. I stood in the center of the room, allowing myself exactly 60 seconds to process the profound, agonizing sting of the betrayal. My chest ached with a deep, cutting sorrow. It is one thing to be attacked by wealthy, arrogant in-laws who always viewed you as an outsider. It is an entirely different kind of violence to be stabbed in the back by the very person you pulled up from the trenches. But 60 seconds was all I could afford. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek, squared my shoulders, and walked over to my desk. I realized in that moment that I was fighting a massive multi-front war against a family with deep, dirty pockets and absolutely no moral boundaries. Julian and Jeremiah were fighting a street brawl using intimidation, theft, and social sabotage. If I wanted to survive, I had to stop playing defense. I had to wage a ruthless corporate war. I sat down at my computer and immediately initiated a total lockdown of my entire digital infrastructure. I revoked every single administrative privilege, reset the master encryption keys, and migrated my sensitive client data to an untraceable ghost server located offsite. I froze my own internal financial accounts, blocking any further unauthorized access. I built an impenetrable digital fortress around my business in less than 20 minutes. Once my empire was secure, I picked up my encrypted private cell phone. I needed to shift to a devastating offense, and to do that I needed a predator. I scrolled through my highly classified contacts and dialed a number I had only used twice in my entire career. The line clicked open, and a deep, gravelly voice answered. Silas. Silas was a corporate shark, a phantom in the financial sector who specialized in aggressive hostile takeovers, distressed asset acquisitions, and burying over-leveraged companies. He was a ruthless, brilliant strategist who operated entirely in the shadows, buying up debts and crushing empires for sport. Chloe. Silas answered, sounding mildly amused. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call from Atlanta's most terrifying crisis manager? I need to initiate a shadow operation, Silas, I said, bypassing any pleasantries, and I need it done faster than legally advisable. Silas chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. I am listening. My fiancé just drained $200,000 of my cash from a joint account, I explained, keeping my voice brisk and analytical. His family also filed a fraudulent $500,000 commercial lien against my public relations firm to force me to sign over my personal real estate. I need to crush them, but I do not just want my money back, Silas. I want to own the very ground Julian and Jeremiah walk on. I heard the sound of the keyboard clacking on the other end of the line. Jeremiah. Silas mused. You are marrying into that particular nightmare. I have been watching his commercial portfolios. The man is bleeding out. He is over-leveraged on 3 major construction loans, and his flagship properties are weeks away from foreclosure. Exactly, I confirmed. They need my penthouse to secure a bridge loan to save their failing empire. I want you to establish a blind limited liability company immediately. Through that proxy, I want you to buy out Jeremiah's most critical defaulting commercial loans. I want to purchase the paper on his flagship properties. I want to be his sole unforgiving creditor. There was a brief pause on the line. Chloe, buying distressed debt of that magnitude requires massive liquid capital. Silas warned, his tone turning serious. To purchase those markers quietly and swiftly, you will have to leverage every single dollar of your personal savings. If their empire officially folds before you can restructure the debt, you could lose everything. You will be completely exposed. I turned my chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the chaotic Atlanta traffic moving silently on the streets below. Julian and Jeremiah thought they could break me by taking my money and tarnishing my name. They thought my power resided in my ounce. They fundamentally misunderstood who I was. My power was my brilliant strategic mind and my absolute refusal to lose. I do not care about the risk, Silas, I stated, my voice as cold and hard as crushed ice. They tried to take my home. They corrupted my own family. They tried to put me in a cage and force me to submit to their legacy, liquidate my personal portfolios, drain my emergency reserves. Use whatever capital you need to secure those loans by tomorrow afternoon. Consider it done, Silas said, the thrill of the hunt clear in his voice. By this time tomorrow, your blind company will hold the keys to their entire kingdom. They will not even know the executioner is in the room until the blade drops. I ended the call and set the phone down on the smooth glass surface of my desk. The smear campaign was still raging outside. The fraudulent lien was still actively freezing my corporate credit. But for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I smiled. A genuine, terrifying smile. Julian had threatened to ruin my life if I did not submit to him at the rehearsal dinner. I had demanded I bring the deed to my penthouse and hand over my entire existence on a silver platter. I fully intended to attend that dinner. I intended to walk into that extravagant country club wearing my finest designer gown. And I intended to hand Julian a folder that would systematically destroy his entire family legacy in front of every single person they had ever tried to impress. The trap was set, and the prey was blindly walking right into the jaws of the beast. The immediate priority was the $200,000 Julian had brazenly drained from our joint account. I knew Julian well enough to understand his particular brand of arrogance. He possessed the swagger of a man raised in the protective bubble of generational wealth, but he entirely lacked the technical sophistication required to hide illicit cash from a woman who spent her entire career burying massive corporate scandals. I bypassed the local authorities completely. Involving the police right now would only trigger a slow bureaucratic investigation, giving his powerful family enough time to leverage their political connections and manipulate the narrative in the press. I needed devastating weapons, not standard police reports. I contacted my firm lead forensic accountant, an absolute genius named David, who had previously untangled the offshore accounts of highly corrupt politicians. I brought David into my private office, locked the door, and instructed him to tear into Julian's digital footprint with absolute zero restrictions. I wanted every single wire transfer, every routing number, and every encrypted transaction unraveled and laid bare on my desk before the end of the day. While David went to work tracking the stolen cash, I paced the length of my office watching the vibrant Atlanta skyline transition from a bright morning to a hazy, humid afternoon. The false narrative, Vivian was actively spinning across the most exclusive Buckhead country clubs, painted Julian as a wealthy, innocent victim of my sudden psychiatric extortion. She was leveraging decades of social capital within the elite Black community to completely isolate me from my peers. I needed the undeniable mathematical proof of his absolute depravity. I needed to know exactly where my money went. It took David less than 5 hours to break through the rudimentary firewalls Julian had attempted to establish. David walked into my office, his usually stoic expression replaced by a look of profound, absolute disgust. He placed a heavily redacted thick stack of financial printouts directly on my glass desk. The dark look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before I even glanced at the highlighted numbers. The money had not been transferred into a legitimate offshore haven. It had not been secured in a hidden family trust to protect it from me before the wedding, as Julian had arrogantly claimed on the phone earlier that morning. The reality was far darker and far more pathetic than a simple family dispute over assets. David explained the precise methodology of the theft. Julian had been siphoning the money during the early morning hours to avoid triggering joint account notification alerts. He used a series of encrypted cryptocurrency wallets to initially mask the destination of the funds, but the blockchain ledger is a permanent public record if you know exactly how to read it. David traced the fragmented funds through a convoluted labyrinth of digital shell companies directly into the accounts of a notorious underground high-stakes gambling syndicate operating out of Vegas and Miami. Julian was not the brilliant, disciplined vice president of his family prestigious investment fund. How was a severe, degenerate gambling addict drowning in toxic, terrifying underground debt? The pristine image of the perfect, polished executive was nothing more than a hollow shell covering a desperate man who owed very dangerous people a lot of money. But the stolen wedding fund was barely a fraction of the devastating truth David had uncovered. The forensic trail did not stop at my $200,000. David kept digging, pulling thread after thread, and he uncovered a financial crater so massive it completely defied belief. Julian had not just drained our joint account to save his own life from the syndicate. He had been actively embezzling tens of millions of dollars from his own father's commercial real estate empire for the past 5 years to cover his catastrophic compounding gambling losses. He had falsified vendor invoices, manipulated quarterly earnings reports, and drained the company liquid capital reserves completely dry. The staggering revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. That was the real reason Jeremiah flagship properties were suddenly defaulting. That was the reason the entire family dynasty was silently crumbling into absolute bankruptcy. Julian had bled his own family dry right under their noses. Jeremiah and Vivian were entirely completely broke because their own golden child had gambled away their generational wealth. And now, instead of holding him accountable, they were desperately trying to use my $2 million unencumbered penthouse to secure a bridge loan to plug a sinking ship that Julian had already destroyed. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice my entire future to cover up their son's criminal addiction. I sat down heavily in my leather chair, staring at the damning paper trail. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Every charity gala Vivian hosted, every booming sermon Jeremiah gave at their megachurch, every condescending remark they made about my self-made background, it was all a meticulously crafted theatrical performance. They were absolutely destitute, clinging to the fragile remnants of their social status while forcing me to pay the ultimate price for their profound systemic failures. Just as I was digesting the sickening magnitude of Julian depravity, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the glass surface of my desk. I glanced down and saw Julian's name flashing on the screen. I did not answer it. I let it ring out, but a moment later a text message notification appeared. I opened the message, and my blood ran completely cold, freezing the very marrow in my bones. It was a high-resolution photograph of my own front door, the heavy custom mahogany door of my private penthouse. He was standing right outside it in the quiet corridor of my supposedly highly secure residential building. He had somehow bypassed the lobby concierge. The penthouse represented the first true milestone of my professional success. It was the physical manifestation of my hard-won independence, a place where I was completely safe from the chaotic world I managed for a living. Seeing him standing there violating my sanctuary was a calculated, terrifying tactic of psychological warfare. A second message arrived immediately after the photograph. It was a long, incredibly menacing paragraph laying out a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. He demanded that I bring the signed deed transfer for the penthouse to the exclusive country club for our rehearsal dinner in exactly 2 days. He warned me that if I failed to hand over my home, he would destroy me so thoroughly I would never work in this country again. I did not just leave it at empty verbal threats. He attached a sample digital file to the message. I opened the attachment and felt a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. It was a highly sophisticated, fabricated federal document engineered to look exactly like an official Department of Justice indictment. Terrence must have helped him create it, using the corporate seal they had stolen from my office the night before. The fake indictment framed my public relations firm as a massive money laundering front for international criminal organizations. Julian's text message continued detailing exactly how he planned to ruin me. He threatened to release this fabricated indictment directly to the press the moment I refused to comply. He boasted that his father's deep connections with the local media and city officials would ensure the fake charges stuck in the court of public opinion long enough to ruin my life forever. He promised that by the time the actual authorities cleared my name, my business would be completely decimated, my clients would be gone, and I would be left absolutely penniless and socially exiled. He ended the message with a chilling final sentence. "You belong to us now, Chloe. Bring the deed or lose everything." I was no longer just a manipulative fiancé trying to bully me at a dinner table. He was a desperate, cornered animal willing to commit federal crimes to save himself from the ruthless gambling syndicates. The physical violation of knowing. He was standing right outside my home. My only true sanctuary was intended to break my spirit and terrorize me into immediate blind submission. He expected me to panic. He expected me to call him sobbing, begging for mercy, pleading for him to leave my property, and promising to sign whatever he wanted just to make the nightmare stop. He wanted a broken victim. But I am a woman who built an empire by outsmarting dangerous predators. Instead of fear, a cold, genuine smile spread slowly across my face. Julian, in his desperate, frantic rush to intimidate me, had just handed me written, undeniable proof of criminal extortion delivered directly from his personal device. He had thoroughly documented his own blackmail attempt. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk, and typed a simple, incredibly calm response to his threatening demands. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not ask him to leave my door. I gave him exactly what he thought he wanted to hear, lulling him into a false sense of absolute security. I will bring the paperwork to the dinner. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation appear on the screen. Let him think he had won. Let Vivian continue her pathetic smear campaign across the Buckhead elite. Let Jeremiah polish his expensive shoes for the rehearsal dinner, believing his financial salvation was finally secured. They had no idea the sheer magnitude of the storm that was rapidly gathering just off their shores. I closed the messaging application and opened my highly secure private banking portal. I bypassed the frozen corporate accounts and accessed my personal unlisted emergency reserves. I stared at the balance representing the last remaining safety net I had accumulated over a decade of relentless, grueling work. It was everything I had left. Every vacation I never took, every luxury I denied myself, condensed into a single digital figure. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I initiated a direct encrypted wire transfer, sending the entire remaining balance of my personal wealth directly to Silas, my ruthless corporate contact. The screen loaded, processing the massive transaction, transferring the funds to purchase the syndicate markers and acquire the defaulting mortgages. The ultimate shadow operation was now fully financed. My proxy company was heavily armed and ready to strike. The impending rehearsal dinner was no longer going to be a celebration of their prestigious legacy. It was going to be an absolute corporate massacre. For the next 48 hours, I completely vanished from the grid. In crisis management, there is a psychological tactic known as the vacuum. When you suddenly stop responding, stop fighting back, and drop off the radar entirely, your enemies will naturally assume they have won. They will drop their guard. Julian and his family took my silence as absolute surrender. They thought my brief text message was the final gasp of a defeated woman who had realized she was hopelessly outmatched. They had no idea I was plunging a dagger directly into their financial jugular. Working in absolute silence, I coordinated every single move with Silas. My office doors remained locked, and I communicated with him solely through a heavily encrypted network. The first phase of our shadow operation required establishing a completely untraceable proxy. Silas created a blind limited liability company registered in Delaware under a labyrinth of holding corporations. We named it Obsidian Holdings. On paper, it was just another faceless, aggressive venture capital firm. In reality, it was the executioner blade forged from my entire life savings. The first target was Julian. His massive gambling debts were scattered across ruthless underground syndicates in Miami and Las Vegas. These were not traditional banks. These were dangerous men who operated in the shadows, and they were growing increasingly impatient with Julian's empty promises. Silas reached out to their intermediaries, presenting Obsidian Holdings as an institutional debt buyer, willing to take on high-risk markers for clean, immediate liquid cash. The syndicates were absolutely thrilled to offload Julian's toxic liabilities. They cared about getting paid, not about who held the paper. Within 24 hours, the massive wire transfers cleared. I sat at my desk, watching the encrypted confirmation receipts flood into my secure inbox. It was a surreal, breathtaking feeling. Julian had stolen $200,000 from me to keep himself breathing. But by purchasing his underground debt markers, I had just become his sole exclusive and entirely unforgiving creditor. He did not owe the Miami cartel anymore. He owed me millions. His physical safety, his freedom, and his entire financial existence now rested entirely in the palm of my hand. But I was not finished. Julian was merely a symptom of the disease. Jeremiah was the source. Phase 2 was the systematic acquisition of Jeremiah's failing real estate empire. Silas moved with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. Jeremiah was completely over-leveraged on 3 massive construction loans, and the primary mortgage on his sprawling Buckhead estate was already in the final stages of pre-foreclosure. The traditional banks holding his commercial paper were exhausted by his continuous requests for extensions. They saw his empire as a sinking ship, and they desperately wanted out before the entire structure collapsed. Silas swooped in, leveraging the remainder of my massive cash injection. He approached the commercial lenders representing Obsidian Holdings as a private equity group specializing in distressed real estate assets. He offered to Jeremiah primary mortgages and commercial loans at a premium, ensuring a lightning-fast transfer of the deeds of trust. The banks, eager to wipe the toxic assets off their books, expedited the paperwork through the county courts. I sat in the quiet solitude of my office, reviewing the heavily stamped legal documents as they arrived via secure courier. The irony was so rich it was practically intoxicating. Jeremiah had sat at his antique mahogany dining table, dripping with patriarchal arrogance, demanding that I sign over my hard-earned penthouse to save his legacy. He had looked down on me because I was a self-made black woman without the pedigree of his generational wealth. Now holding the crisp, legally binding deeds of trust, I literally owned the roof over his head. I owned the flagship commercial towers that bore his family name. I held the absolute destruction of his entire dynasty inside a single leather folder. While I was meticulously building their financial coffin, Vivian was busy throwing a lavish victory parade across Atlanta elite society. Her sheer delusion was almost fascinating to watch. My network of loyal informants across the city kept me updated on her every move. She spent the 2 days before the rehearsal dinner holding court at her exclusive country club, boasting loudly to anyone who would listen. According to Vivian, the crisis was over. She spun a masterful narrative claiming that my brief bout of hysterical wedding anxiety had been successfully managed by her strong, capable son. She told the wealthy matriarchs of Buckhead that Julian had firmly put his foot down and graciously guided me back to reality. She bragged that she was allowing me to join their prestigious family purely out of the kindness of her Christian heart, and that I was finally learning how to submit to their superior social standing. She genuinely believed her smear campaign had broken my spirit and brought me to my knees. Her arrogance peaked on the afternoon of the rehearsal dinner. My private phone buzzed on my desk. It was a direct text message from Vivian. The tone was so thick with patronizing condescension it practically dripped from the screen. "Chloe, dear," the message read, "I am so pleased you have finally decided to cooperate and bring the necessary paperwork tonight. Please remember that tonight, dinner will be attended by the most prominent members of our church and our esteemed business partners. I expect you to wear something modest and appropriate, nothing too flashy or new money. We need you to look the part of a quiet, supportive wife. See you at 7. I read the message twice, a low, dark laugh escaping my lips. Vivian wanted me to be a quiet, submissive accessory. She wanted me to fade into the background so her family could shine. She wanted to strip away my power, my identity, and my pride, leaving behind an obedient shell they could easily control. I locked my office and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. The 48 hours of absolute silence were officially over. The time for hiding in the shadows had passed. I arrived at my penthouse and walked directly into my massive walk-in closet. I bypassed the modest conservative dresses Vivian would have deemed appropriate for a submissive bride. I reached for a garment bag tucked in the very back, pulling out a breathtaking custom-designed silk gown. It was not quiet. It was not modest. It was a fierce, vibrant shade of blood red. It was a dress designed to command an entire room. A dress that demanded absolute attention and radiated pure, unapologetic power. It was the color of a declaration of war. I spent the next hour preparing myself with surgical precision. I applied my makeup flawlessly, highlighting my features to project sharp, cold authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style that left my face completely exposed. I swiped a bold crimson lipstick across my lips, matching the devastating color of the gown. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see a victim. I did not see a woman who had been bullied, blackmailed, or betrayed. I saw a corporate predator ready to devour her prey. I walked into my home office and picked up a brand new expensive black leather folder. I unsealed the courier packages containing the expedited legal documents. I pulled out the formal debt markers transferring Julian illegal gambling debts to my proxy company. I pulled out the court-stamped deeds of trust, proving my total ownership of Jeremiah Estate and his commercial properties. I placed them neatly inside the leather folder, alongside the high-definition security photo of Terrence breaking into my safe and the frozen financial logs showing Julian theft. I ran my manicured hand over the smooth leather of the folder. Inside these covers lay the total annihilation of the family that had tried to destroy me. They wanted a signed document to save their legacy. I was going to give them a stack of documents that would end it permanently. I picked up my designer clutch, grabbed my car keys, and walked out of my penthouse. The trap was flawlessly set. The jaws were primed and waiting. It was time to go to dinner. The drive to the Buckhead Country Club was a masterclass in anticipation. I navigated my car through the winding, manicured streets of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhood. The towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss felt like silent witnesses to the corporate execution I was about to perform. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the club. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed to open my door. I stepped out, letting the Georgia evening heat wrap around my blood-red silk gown. The fabric moved like liquid fire against the pristine cobblestone driveway. I handed my keys to the valet, keeping a firm grip on my black leather folder. Inside the club, the atmosphere was intoxicatingly arrogant. The grand ballroom was a spectacular display of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh, bright light on the city, most influential power brokers. I scanned the room, instantly recognizing mega church pastors, local politicians, and wealthy business moguls. Waiters in black ties circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Everyone was laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to the fact that the prominent family hosting them was entirely secretly bankrupt. They were standing on the deck of the Titanic, sipping vintage wine while I held the iceberg in my hands. The moment I crossed the threshold into the ballroom, the energy shifted. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd of elite socialites. My dress was an unapologetic declaration of dominance, and it immediately triggered the fragile insecurities of the old money crowd. Vivian spotted me from across the room. She was wearing a conservative pearl-colored gown that made her look like a ghost of past decades. Her forced smile tightened into a brittle grimace as she marched toward me. "Chloe, dear Vivian," said her voice unnaturally loud, designed to capture the attention of the surrounding guests. "You certainly made a bold choice with that dress tonight. I suppose we should expect nothing less from someone with your particular background. We usually prefer something a little more elegant and muted for family gatherings, but I assume you just do not know any better." I smiled warmly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Thank you, Vivian. I dressed exactly for the occasion I intended to have." She hooked her arm through mine with a tight, painful grip and steered me away from the center of the room. I noticed the seating arrangements immediately. The main tables were positioned right in front of the stage, draped in heavy white linen and decorated with towering floral centerpieces. Julian, Jeremiah, and Terrence were seated there, laughing with a group of influential city council members. Vivian did not lead me to the head table where a future bride rightfully belonged. Instead, she walked me toward a small secondary table tucked away in a dimly lit corner near the kitchen entrance. The disrespect was deliberate and highly calculated. "I thought you would be more comfortable back here," Vivian announced, gesturing to a chair next to an elderly, distant aunt who was already half asleep. "The main tables are reserved for the immediate family and our core business partners. We need people who truly understand the stakes of our legacy sitting up front. I am sure you understand. You can just sit here quietly and watch how proper society behaves." She turned to a group of older, wealthy women standing nearby. They were all wearing matching pearl necklaces and judgmental stares. Vivian lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper that was easily loud enough for me to hear. She is having a very difficult week. Vivian sighed, shaking her head with fake maternal concern. We are trying to be patient with her unpredictable temperament. She lacks the proper pedigree for this kind of pressure, but Julian is determined to break her in. We just have to teach her how to submit to a real family. It is an incredibly heavy burden on my poor son. The women murmured in sympathetic agreement, casting pitying glances in my direction. They saw me as a charity case, a volatile outsider being tamed by a noble dynasty. I took my seat at the back table, placing my leather folder carefully on my lap. I did not argue. I did not cause a scene. I sat there in the shadows, sipping my sparkling water and watching the magnificent facade play out. Let them whisper, let them feel superior. Their arrogance was the very anesthesia they needed before the surgery I was about to perform. Dinner was a lavish, agonizingly slow affair. The waitstaff brought out plates of roasted quail and truffles, but I barely touched my food. I watched Julian work the room, shaking hands and flashing that brilliant, empty smile. He looked completely unburdened. He genuinely believed that his extortion attempt had worked. I thought my presence here in this room meant I was ready to surrender my $2 million penthouse to cover his toxic gambling debts. He thought he had successfully terrified me into absolute submission. Every time he caught my eye across the crowded room, he offered a chilling, victorious smirk. I was absolutely convinced that he had broken the mighty crisis manager. As the dessert plates were cleared, the heavy velvet curtains at the front of the room were drawn back. The room fell silent as Jeremiah walked up the steps to the stage. He stood right behind the grand wooden podium, adjusting the microphone with the practiced ease of a mega-church pastor who was used to commanding thousands of followers. He looked out over the crowd, his chest puffed out with patriarchal pride. The stage lighting caught his expensive suit, making him look like a true titan of industry. Welcome, friends, family, and esteemed partners. Jeremiah began, his booming baritone voice echoing through the massive ballroom. Tonight we celebrate more than just a wedding. We celebrate the continuation of a great legacy. We celebrate the enduring power of family. We celebrate the generational wealth and profound respect that the name we carry commands in this fine city. The crowd clapped enthusiastically. I watched him stroke his own ego, completely blind to the fact that I held the foreclosure documents for the very estate he was returning to tonight. He was preaching to a room of elites about building a dynasty while his own financial house was actively burning to the ground. In our community, Jeremiah continued, pacing slowly across the stage. We understand that building a dynasty requires sacrifice. It requires vision. But most importantly, it requires strong, undeniable leadership and absolute submission to that leadership. A successful empire cannot have two masters. It requires a strong man at the helm, providing protection, and a woman who understands the divine grace of falling in line behind him. He stopped pacing and looked directly across the room, his eyes locking onto mine in the back corner. The entire ballroom followed his gaze, turning in their seats to stare at me. The silence grew heavy and suffocating. He was making a deliberate public spectacle of my required obedience. He was using this audience to verbally brand me as his subordinate. When Julian told us he wanted to bring Chloe into our family, we knew it would be a challenge. Jeremiah preached, his voice dropping into a tone of benevolent pity. She comes from a world of ruthless independence. She is used to fighting for herself on the streets. But true strength for a woman is knowing when to lay down her weapons and hand the reins over to her husband. It is knowing that her individual assets, her reckless ambitions, and her pride must be folded into the greater good of the family name. We are proud to guide her into this new chapter of beautiful, quiet submission. A few people clapped. Others nodded solemnly, clearly agreeing with his outdated patriarchal rhetoric. I maintained steady, unwavering eye contact with Jeremiah. I did not break his gaze. I offered a slow, knowing smile. He faltered for a fraction of a second, thrown off by my complete lack of humiliation, but he quickly recovered and raised his glass high in the air. To Julian and his new bride, Jeremiah toasted loudly. May they build a future worthy of our name. The room erupted in applause as Jeremiah stepped back. But the performance was not over. Julian stepped right up to the microphone, his eyes glittering with a toxic, victorious light. He looked devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, the perfect picture of a successful heir. The crowd hushed again, anticipating his words. "Thank you, Father," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk. "Your guidance means everything to us. We strive to live up to the standard you set. And speaking of building our future together, my beautiful bride has a very special gift for the family tonight." He reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out the familiar manila envelope, extracting the penthouse transfer deed. "Chloe," he smiled, "please come up to the stage." The walk from my secluded table in the dim corner of the ballroom to the brightly lit stage felt like walking an executioner path, though not in the way they expected. Every single eye in that massive, opulent space was locked onto me. The elite of Atlanta society, the mega-church board members, the local politicians, they all watched with bated breath. They expected a timid, grateful bride humbled by the grand patriarch and his golden son. I smoothed my blood-red silk gown, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the black leather folder tucked securely under my arm. The silk moved fluidly around my legs as I began the long, deliberate walk toward the front of the room. Julian stood at the microphone, looking like the perfect, benevolent leader. He held out his hand to help me up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. As I placed my hand in his grip was incredibly tight, his fingers digging into my skin with an aggressive, desperate force that bruised. He pulled me close, presenting a flawless picture of unified romance to the politely clapping audience. But as he leaned in, brushing his cheek against mine in a fake display of affection, his entire demeanor shifted completely. He reached into the breast pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and produced a heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc fountain pen. He pressed the cold metal aggressively into my palm. "Sign it right now!" Julian whispered, his voice a lethal, frantic hiss, completely detached from the warm, charming smile plastered brightly across his face. The microphone was positioned just far enough away that his venomous words were meant strictly for me. "Sign it now, or I make the call to the press tonight. I will release the fake federal indictment to every news outlet in Georgia. I will ruin your life, Chloe. You will leave this country club in handcuffs." His breath was shallow and rapid, revealing the sheer, unadulterated terror hiding beneath his expensive facade. He was completely out of time with the violent gambling syndicates, and this was his final desperate play for survival. He genuinely believed he had me trapped in an inescapable corner. He believed that the crushing weight of the audience, the immense social pressure of the Buckhead elite, and his terrifying threats would break my will and force my hand. I looked down at the documents resting innocently on the heavy wooden podium. The deed transfer. It was legally flawless, expertly drafted by their high-priced lawyers to systematically strip me of my $2 million penthouse and leave me with absolutely nothing. I picked up the heavy gold pen, feeling its weight between my fingers. I deliberately let my shoulders drop slightly, physically projecting the exact image of a defeated, broken woman finally submitting to a vastly superior power. I let my head bow, playing the perfect role of the conquered outsider. A collective, audible sigh of satisfaction rippled through the front tables reserved for the inner circle. I glanced toward Vivian from beneath my eyelashes. She was sitting perfectly upright in her chair, her chin tilted high, a smug, victorious smile stretching widely across her face. She took a slow, celebratory sip of her vintage champagne, leaning over to whisper something triumphant and undoubtedly cruel to the mayor-wife sitting directly beside her. Vivian truly thought she had successfully tamed the wild, fiercely independent woman she despised. Jeremiah stood just to the side of the stage, his arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. He nodded at me, an arrogant, heavy gesture of patriarchal approval. He looked at me not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a conquered asset. He thought his ultimate financial salvation was only a signature away, completely unaware that his empire was already dead. At the adjacent VIP table, Sienna and Terrence were barely containing their malicious glee. Sienna actually raised her crystal champagne flute high in the air, offering a mocking, premature toast squarely in my direction. Terrence flashed his expensive limited edition watch, the exact same watch I had on high-definition backup video from the corporate break-in, and offered a thoroughly arrogant smirk. They thought their flawless corporate sabotage had worked perfectly. They thought the fraudulent commercial lion had terrified me into absolute surrender. I slowly positioned the gold tip of the fountain pen mere inches above the signature line. The grand ballroom was so quiet, you could hear the gentle hum of the massive air conditioning units and the faint clinking of ice in water glasses. Julian leaned in closer, his eyes fixed greedily on the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. I was practically vibrating with desperate anticipation, his entire future hanging on the next movement of my hand. I held the pen there for 5 agonizing silent seconds. I let them deeply taste the victory. I let them feel the absolute intoxicating certainty of their triumph settling into their bones. I let them believe they had successfully destroyed me. Then I slowly, deliberately straightened my spine. I lifted the pen away from the paper, breaking the illusion instantly. I looked at Julian, seeing the sudden sharp flash of confusion register in his panicked eyes as my posture shifted dramatically from submissive to entirely commanding. I turned away from his grasping hands and stepped directly up to the microphone. I reached up with one manicured finger and tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified sound echoed violently across the massive ballroom, instantly commanding the absolute undivided attention of every single person in the room. The low murmurs died instantly. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped completely. Hundreds of faces stared up at me, sensing a sudden, unexpected shift in the theatrical performance. "Julian is right," I said, my voice projecting loud, clear, and perfectly steady through the state-of-the-art sound system. My tone was no longer that of a quiet, cooperative, broken bride. It was the sharp, authoritative, uncompromising voice of a corporate crisis manager stepping up to a press conference podium. Julian lunged forward slightly, his hand reaching out to grab the microphone stand, but I stepped smoothly out of his reach, maintaining my dominant elevated position at the very front of the stage. His panic was becoming visible to the front row. "Marriage is indeed about merging assets." I continued, my gaze sweeping slowly across the crowd of wealthy, influential elites. "It is about building a solid foundation of trust, absolute transparency, and shared legacy. When you join a prestigious historical family like this one, you are expected to bring your very best to the table. You are expected to contribute to the grand dynasty that has been built over decades." Vivian's smug smile faltered her champagne glass, freezing halfway to her lips. Jeremiah uncrossed his arms, a deep, wary frown carving harsh lines into his forehead. They could instantly sense the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. The obedient script they had written for me was suddenly being shredded and rewritten live on stage. I looked down at the penthouse deed, resting on the podium, running my hand lightly over the crisp paper, then looked back out at the captivated audience. But before I blindly sign away the sole ownership of my home, a property I purchased outright with my own hard-earned money and countless sleepless nights, I think it is only fair that our esteemed guests understand exactly what kind of legacy I am buying into. I think everyone in this majestic room deserves to know the true hidden financial foundation of the family hosting this lavish dinner tonight. Julian's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly, terrified shade of gray. He stepped aggressively toward me, abandoning the charming facade. Entirely, his voice a frantic, desperate hiss caught by the edge of the microphone. "Chloe, shut up. Do not do this. I will ruin you." I ignored him completely. My eyes locked on the audience. I held out my hand over the edge of the podium and deliberately, methodically dropped his luxury gold fountain pen. It hit the hardwood floor of the stage with a sharp, heavy clatter that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. The sound made Vivian jump in her seat. Sienna lowered her champagne glass, her mocking smile completely wiped away by the sudden terrifying realization that they were no longer in control of the narrative. I reached for my brand new black leather folder, resting securely on the edge of the podium. I smoothly unzipped the top, the metallic sound cutting sharply through the thick, suffocating tension filling the ballroom. I reached inside the dark interior and pulled out the first thick stack of court-stamped, legally binding documents. The crisp white paper contrasted sharply against the vibrant blood-red silk of my designer gown. I looked at Julian, watching him tremble with absolute, unavoidable defeat. I looked down at Jeremiah, whose patriarchal arrogance was rapidly dissolving into sheer, unadulterated panic. And finally, I looked out at the sea of powerful guests, waiting with bated breath to see what secrets I was about to unleash. The trap was flawlessly sprung, the executioner blade was raised high, and there was absolutely no turning back. I pulled the first thick stack of papers from the dark interior of the folder, holding them up under the harsh glare of the stage lights. The heavy parchment caught the illumination, the stark black ink of the official county seals clearly visible to the front tables. I stepped squarely up to the microphone, ensuring my posture was completely unyielding. I did not raise my voice to a shout. True power does not need to scream to be heard. I kept my tone conversational, yet laced with lethal authority, projecting my words effortlessly across the dead silent ballroom. These documents, I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, suffocated air, are certified notices of default and imminent foreclosure. They represent the true hidden reality of the majestic legacy you were just asked to dutifully applaud. I looked directly down at the prominent church elders, the politicians, and the wealthy investors seated at the prime tables. The men and women who had just been nodding along to Jeremiah's arrogant sermon about male leadership and financial dominance were now staring up at me in absolute shock. Jeremiah's flagship, commercial properties, the very towering skyscrapers that define his supposed untouchable empire, have been bleeding cash for years, I declared, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer. He is currently tens of millions of dollars in default on 3 massive commercial construction loans. The bank has already initiated the final stages of asset seizure. The influential family hosting you in this extravagant country club tonight is completely and utterly broke. They do not have a single cent to their prestigious name. The reaction was a physical shockwave that violently rippled through the massive space. The influential guests sitting in the front rows gasped audibly, their eyes darting rapidly from my face to Jeremiah. The sudden brutal exposure of absolute financial ruin is the ultimate cardinal sin in Buckhead high society. It is the one failure that can never be forgiven or overlooked. Jeremiah's face transformed instantly from a mask of arrogant patriarchal pride to a violently flushed shade of purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged dangerously as the horrifying reality of his public unmasking fully registered in his brain. His entire carefully cultivated identity as a fearless titan of industry and a wealthy, powerful pillar of the community was rapidly disintegrating live on stage in front of his most critical peers. He let out a furious, unintelligible roar and lunged aggressively toward the microphone, his large, heavy hands reaching out to physically tear the damning documents from my grasp. He wanted to rip the truth to shreds and silence me through sheer physical intimidation. But I was a seasoned crisis manager, heavily trained to anticipate and effortlessly evade aggressive physical escalation. I stepped smoothly backward, executing a flawless, calculated pivot that left him blindly grasping at empty air. He stumbled awkwardly, his heavy frame thrown completely off balance. He nearly crashed into the wooden podium, thoroughly humiliating himself in front of his entire stunned congregation and his elite business partners. The great untouchable patriarch looked like nothing more than a clumsy, desperate old man. I did not give the room a single second to recover from the initial shock. I reached right back into this black leather folder and extracted the second set of meticulously compiled documents. I turned my absolute attention away from the humiliated patriarch and aimed my sights directly at the VIP table where Terence was sitting. His arrogant, mocking smirk was already beginning to slip, rapidly replaced by a deeply unsettling sense of impending doom. He realized that if I knew about the foreclosures, I likely knew everything else. I held up the high-resolution printed security photograph along with the heavy stack of digital server logs, brandishing them like a weapon. This second package. I continued, my voice rising steadily to dominate the rising, anxious murmurs of the confused crowd, is incontrovertible proof of targeted corporate espionage and high-level financial fraud. I pointed my finger squarely at Terence, making sure every single person in the room followed my direct line of sight straight to his frozen, terrified face. Just 24 hours ago, Terence illegally bypassed a military-grade security system to break into the private safe inside my executive office. He stole my official corporate seal and utilized a heavily encrypted digital network to forge a $500,000 commercial lien against my public relations firm. The audience let out another collective gasp, the sheer criminality of the accusation sending shockwaves through the conservative crowd. He committed multiple federal felonies, simply to terrorize me into handing over my personal real estate to save his father-in-law's sinking ship, I stated, laying the absolute truth bare for everyone to digest. He tried to bankrupt an innocent woman, to cover up the sheer incompetence of this supposedly grand dynasty. Terrence's face drained of all human color, turning a sickly, terrifying shade of ash gray. His eyes darted wildly around the room looking for any possible avenue of escape, but finding none. The crystal champagne flute he was holding slipped right through his suddenly numb, unresponsive fingers. It hit the sharp edge of the table and crashed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering, jagged pieces. The sharp, violent sound of the breaking glass shattered the remaining tension in the room, releasing a flood of absolute pandemonium. That was the exact moment Vivian completely lost her mind. The fragile, elegant facade of the perfect high society matriarch shattered into absolute hysteria. She could no longer maintain the illusion of quiet grace. She leaped from her chair, knocking it backward, so forcefully it crashed loudly into the neighboring table, spilling expensive wine across the white linens. She began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the stage. Her carefully styled hair fell out of place, making her look entirely unhinged in front of the people she wanted to impress the most. "She is a liar!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer desperation and uncontrollable frantic panic. "She is a hysterical, crazy woman making up ridiculous stories because we refuse to tolerate her unpredictable, erratic behavior. Security, remove her from this stage immediately. Somebody get this deranged, dangerous woman out of my sight. Arrest her for slander before she completely ruins this beautiful evening." But the country club security guards did not move a single muscle. They stood by the doors watching the unfolding drama with the same shocked fascination as the rest of the attendees. The ballroom had descended into total unprecedented chaos. The wealthy, influential guests, the very people Vivian had spent decades carefully courting, entertaining, and desperately trying to impress, were no longer politely listening to her commands. They were smelling blood in the water. The elite members of Atlanta society thrive on this exact kind of catastrophic scandal. All across the dimly lit room, I saw the glowing rectangular screens of hundreds of smartphones rising swiftly into the air. The distinguished guests were actively recording the spectacular, devastating implosion of the perfect dynasty. The bright flashes from their phone cameras illuminated Vivian, desperate, screeching face capturing her total psychological collapse in brilliant high definition for the entire internet to see and judge for eternity. Julian realized that his entire life, his pristine reputation, his freedom, and his physical safety from the gambling syndicates were actively burning to ash right in front of him. He abandoned any remaining pretense of being a civilized, polished gentleman. His survival instincts completely took over, overriding his common sense and any remaining self-control. He lunged violently across the stage and grabbed my left arm with a brutal, unforgiving force. His thick fingers dug painfully into my bare skin, squeezing hard enough to leave deep, permanent bruises. He tried to physically drag me away from the microphone, his chest heaving with physical exertion. "Shut your mouth right now!" Julian snarled, his handsome face contorted into a terrifying, ugly mask of pure, feral desperation. "You are ruining absolutely everything. Stop talking or I swear I will make you regret this." I did not panic. I did not scream or cry out for help. I simply looked down at his bruising hand gripping my arm and then looked back up at his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I effortlessly twisted my arm, utilizing a sharp, highly effective defensive maneuver I had learned years ago. I broke his painful grip entirely and shoved him forcefully backward, creating an immediate wall of distance between us. I smoothed the sleeve of my red silk gown, completely unbothered by his pathetic physical assault. I locked my eyes with the hidden audiovisual technician securely stationed in the dark elevated booth at the very back of the massive ballroom. I had personally paid him $10,000 in untraceable cash 3 hours before the dinner started for this exact precise moment. I gave him a single sharp, deliberate nod. Behind the stage, a massive, heavy mechanical hum vibrated deeply through the padded walls. The enormous white projector screen smoothly descended from the high ceiling, dropping directly behind Julian's terrified face. The high-powered laser projector mounted in the back of the room flickered brightly to life, casting a blinding, crisp rectangular glow across the dark stage. The execution was just getting started, and I fully intended to finish the absolute destruction of their entire empire. The massive white projector screen illuminated the darkened stage with the blinding, intense glare of a police interrogation spotlight. I did not need to say a single word for the first 10 seconds. I simply let the undeniable visual evidence do the talking for me. The very first image to flash across the 60-foot display was a high-resolution screenshot of the joint bank account Julian and I had opened specifically for our wedding expenses. The original balance of $200,000 was highlighted in bright green. Then the screen transitioned with a sharp digital click, showing the exact same account at 3 o'clock in the morning on the night of the infamous dining room ambush. The new balance of $0 was circled in glaring, aggressive red ink. The polite, confused murmurs in the ballroom instantly began to swell into a loud, chaotic buzz. The wealthy socialites and powerful investors craned their necks, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. But the financial presentation was only just beginning. The next slide revealed a meticulous forensic accounting web. It showed the exact routing numbers and digital pathways Julian had used to siphon my hard-earned cash out of our joint account. The money had not gone to a vendor, a wedding planner, or a family trust as he had claimed. The screen clearly displayed the final destinations of the fractured wire transfers. They led directly into the offshore accounts of two highly notorious underground gambling syndicates operating out of Las Vegas and Miami. I had even included the official law enforcement dossiers on the syndicate leaders right next to Julian transaction logs. Julian stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. His knees actually buckled, and he had to grab the sharp edge of the wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing completely onto the hardwood stage floor. His face was no longer just pale, it was entirely, completely drained of life. The charming, polished vice president was gone. In his place stood a terrified, broken addict whose darkest, most shameful secret was currently being broadcast in high definition to every single person he had ever tried to impress. I turned my body to face him directly, completely ignoring the frantic gasps and shocked whispers echoing violently through the country club. I raised the microphone to my lips. "You stood in your father's dining room and told me you were holding my money for safekeeping," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, lethal clarity that commanded total silence in the room. "You tried to extort me for my $2 million penthouse. You claimed you were going to teach me how to be a submissive, cooperative wife. But the truth is, Julian, you are nothing but a degenerate gambling addict who stole $200,000 from his fiancé to stop a criminal syndicate from breaking his legs." Julian shook his head, frantically raising his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of denial. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of all its former arrogant power. "Turn it off. I can explain everything. Please just turn it off." "There is nothing left to explain, Julian," I replied, stepping closer to him so he could look directly into the eyes of the woman he had so severely underestimated. "You stole my cash to pay off your massive toxic debts. But what you did not know is that yesterday afternoon, my private limited liability company approached those exact same syndicates. I bought out every single one of your outstanding markers. They were absolutely thrilled to offload your high-risk liabilities for clean, immediate liquid cash." Julian's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the terrifying reality of my words finally penetrated his panic. He stopped shaking his head and just stared at me, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. "You do not owe the syndicate anymore, Julian," I declared, delivering the devastating blow with surgical, absolute precision. "You owe me. I am your sole, exclusive, and entirely unforgiving creditor. I own your debt. I own your financial future. Your physical safety and your freedom now rest entirely in my hands." A woman in the front row actually fainted, slumping over her velvet chair, as the sheer magnitude of the scandal broke through her polite society conditioning. The pastors and politicians at the VIP tables were actively physically distancing themselves from the family, pushing their heavy chairs back to avoid being associated with the radioactive fallout. But I was not finished. The execution required a double tap, and I had deliberately saved the most destructive ammunition for the patriarch himself. I turned my back on the weeping, trembling shell of the man I was once supposed to marry. I locked my eyes directly onto Jeremiah. He was still standing near the edge of the stage, frozen in a state of catatonic shock. His powerful chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The expensive tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a very small, desperate man. The massive projector screen clicked again, echoing loudly in the silent room. The gambling ledgers vanished, instantly replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of Jeremiah's failing real estate empire. The screen displayed the official defaulted commercial loans, his over-leveraged construction projects, and finally the primary mortgage document for his sprawling Buckhead estate. Jeremiah, I called out, forcing him to look at the massive screen behind me. You stood up here tonight and preached a very passionate, arrogant sermon about building a lasting family dynasty. You lectured me about male leadership and required female submission. You tried to force me to surrender my personal property to plug the gaping holes in your sinking ship. Jeremiah tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He simply let out a low, agonizing wheeze, clutching his hand over his heart. And that commercial debt you were desperately trying to pay off by stealing my penthouse? I asked, my voice echoing with absolute, unchallenged authority. I bought that too. The ballroom erupted in a secondary wave of absolute pandemonium. Guests were shouting, covering their mouths in horror, and frantically typing on their phones to spread the scandal across the city. The noise was deafening, but I cut right through it. I used the exact same proxy company to acquire the primary mortgages on your flagship properties and your family estate. I continued, ensuring my words sliced through the rising noise. The banks were exhausted by your constant failures and endless excuses. They sold me your commercial paper at a premium just to wipe your toxic incompetence off their books. You do not own a dynasty, Jeremiah. You do not even own the roof over your head. I own the mortgage to the house you are sleeping in tonight. I hold the absolute keys to your entire fraudulent kingdom. The sheer absolute finality of the statement crushed the remaining air out of the grand ballroom. Jeremiah's legs finally gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into a chair at the front table, staring blankly at the floor. The great untouchable patriarch had been completely, utterly dismantled by the self-made black woman he had dared to view as an inferior asset to be acquired and controlled. Vivian was no longer screaming for security. She was sitting in her chair, completely silent, her face buried in her shaking hands, rocking back and forth as her entire social universe systematically evaporated around her. She knew that after tonight she would never be invited to another charity gala, she would never sit on another alumni board, and she would never show her face in Buckhead society again. Her legacy was permanently reduced to ash. Terrence had completely frozen at his table, his eyes fixed terrifyingly on the exit doors. He knew the forged commercial lien and the corporate espionage were far worse than mere financial ruin. He knew he had committed multiple federal felonies, and he was frantically calculating his odds of escaping the country club before the full weight of the law crashed down upon him. I stood at the center of the stage, completely untouched by the magnificent ruin surrounding me. I looked at the broken family that had tried to steal my independence, my money, and my pride. They had demanded my absolute submission. Instead, I had forced them into total, inescapable surrender. I had not just leveled the playing field, I had bought the entire stadium and permanently locked them outside. The realization that I now literally owned the family settled heavily over the paralyzed crowd. No one dared to speak. No one dared to intervene or offer a single word of comfort to the disgraced dynasty. They simply stared at me in a mixture of profound awe and absolute visceral terror. They finally understood exactly why I was the most feared crisis manager in the Southeast. I slowly reached down and closed my black leather folder. The sharp zip of the metal fastener signaled the absolute definitive end of the corporate massacre. The financial execution was officially complete. But justice in my world is never just financial, it is always comprehensive. Just as Julian dropped to his knees on the stage, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly into the quiet room, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the grand banquet hall swung violently open. The sudden sharp movement drew the eyes of every single guest in the room. Through the massive glass partitions of the country club foyer, a new frantic light show began to play. It was not the warm golden glow of the crystal chandeliers or the harsh white glare of the projector screen. It was the sharp, aggressive flashing of bright blue and red lights reflecting menacingly off the polished glass doors and the marble floors. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open, hitting the surrounding walls with a resounding violent crash that echoed over the dead silence of the crowd. Four uniformed Atlanta police officers strode into the room, their expressions hardened and strictly professional. Their heavy boots thudded in perfect unison against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the thick, suffocating tension that had gripped the elite country club. Behind them walked two plainclothes detectives flashing gold badges attached to their belts. The sheer visual impact of law enforcement storming an elite Buckhead rehearsal dinner was entirely unprecedented. Wealthy guests scrambled out of the way, pulling their chairs back, desperately trying to avoid any physical proximity to the impending arrests. The officers did not hesitate. They did not pause to ask questions or survey the room. I had already provided them with the exact GPS coordinates, the unedited high-definition security footage, the digital metadata, and the sworn statements hours before I even put on my red silk dress. They knew exactly who they were looking for tonight, and they moved with the absolute certainty of justice. Julian froze on the stage, his hands raised slightly as if anticipating the cold metal of handcuffs. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable arrest. He was a coward expecting to pay for his financial crimes right then and there. But the lead detective walked right past the stage, completely ignoring the trembling bankrupt vice president. The officers marched in a straight, unwavering line directly toward the VIP table where Terrence was still sitting frozen in absolute terror. Terrence tried to stand his chair, screeching loudly against the polished wood floor. He raised his hands, stammering frantically about a misunderstanding, claiming he was a respected chief financial officer and that there had been a terrible mistake. He tried to invoke his father-in-law name, desperately searching for a lifeline. The lead detective did not let him finish his pathetic explanation. He grabbed Terrence by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed his hands down onto the crisp white tablecloth. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Terrence's wrists rang out clearly through the silent room. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate espionage, and multiple counts of federal wire fraud," the detective announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Sienna let out a blood-curdling hysterical scream. She lunged forward, grabbing the officer's arm, her pastel designer dress catching on the edge of the table. "You cannot do this!" Sienna shrieked, tears and ruined makeup streaming down her face. "Do you know who we are? My father is a pillar of this community. My husband is an innocent man. Chloe is framing us. This is a complete setup. She is the criminal, not him." The officers completely ignored her frantic, flailing protests. Two uniformed cops flanked Terrence, physically dragging the disgraced executive away from the table. Terrence looked back at me one last time, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that he was actually going to a federal prison. I simply offered him a slow, cold nod of confirmation. The master passcode had not saved him. It had only locked his cell door. As Terrence was marched out of the ballroom in handcuffs, the camera flashes from the audience intensified, capturing every humiliating second of the family destruction. Jeremiah, the great patriarchal titan, could no longer bear the immense suffocating weight of his total public ruin. The realization that his financial crimes and ultimate failure were exposed to his entire congregation and business network was a fatal blow to his massive ego. He clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow, rapid, and ragged. He stumbled backward, knocking a tall crystal vase to the floor. The shattering glass echoed the breaking of his dynasty. The man who had demanded my absolute submission just 20 minutes ago was now gasping for air, leaning heavily against a terrified waiter to keep from collapsing entirely. He looked out at the faces of his church elders, his political allies, and his investors. He searched their faces for salvation, but he saw absolutely no sympathy, only profound disgust and eager, unrelenting judgment. His legacy, his dynasty, his entire meticulously crafted identity had been utterly eradicated in a single evening. He slumped heavily into a chair, staring blankly at his own shaking hands, a completely broken, irrelevant man. Vivian, witnessing the total collapse of her husband and the brutal arrest of her son-in-law, snapped entirely. Her reality was fractured beyond repair. The flawless image she had spent a lifetime building had been burned to the ground by the very woman she had openly despised and mocked. She locked eyes with me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She let out a guttural, furious wail and charged directly toward the stage. She scrambled up the carpeted steps, her pearl-colored gown tearing at the hem as she tripped over her own feet. She raised her hand, her fingers curled into a desperate claw, aiming a violent, frenzied slap directly at my face. "You ruined us!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with sheer madness and uncontrollable rage. "You took everything from my family." I did not flinch. I did not even raise my hands to defend myself. I simply took one precise, calculated step backward. Vivian momentum carried her forward, her hand swinging wildly through empty air. The missed strike threw her entirely off balance. She stumbled forward, her designer heels catching on the hard edge of the wooden podium. She collapsed heavily onto the hard stage floor, her knees hitting the wood with a sickening, audible thud. She did not try to get back up. She simply stayed there on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, burying her face in the expensive silk of her ruined dress. The grand matriarch of Atlanta elite society was permanently reduced to a sobbing, hysterical mess at my feet, loudly mourning the absolute death of her social supremacy. The society guests kept recording, sealing her permanent exile from the elite circles she worshipped. Julian was the last one left standing. He looked at his father clutching his chest, his mother wailing on the floor, and watched the doors swing shut behind his brother-in-law, being hauled away in handcuffs. The absolute totality of the devastation finally registered in his panicked mind. He realized that I had not just matched his terrible threats. I had buried his entire lineage under an avalanche of undeniable legal and financial consequences. His prestigious life was completely over. The vicious gambling syndicates would discover his total financial ruin by tomorrow morning. He had absolutely no money, no hidden assets, no family protection, and absolutely no way out of the terrifying corner he had backed himself into. He was entirely at my mercy, owing millions to a woman he had tried to emotionally break and financially extort. Julian turned to me, his handsome face slick with cold sweat and tears. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the center of the stage. The bright, unforgiving glare of the massive projector screen illuminated his desperate, pathetic posture for every single cell phone camera in the room. The elite crowd pressed closer, actively recording the once golden child of Buckhead shamelessly begging for his life. Julian crawled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out frantically. He grabbed the hem of my blood-red silk gown, gripping the expensive fabric as if it were his only remaining lifeline in a drowning sea. "Chloe, please," Julian wept, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed loudly through the microphone I had left resting on the podium. "I am so sorry. I was desperate. The syndicates were threatening to kill me. I did not want to hurt you. I just needed the money to survive. Please, you have to help me." I looked down at his shaking, tear-stained face. I did not pull my dress away. I let him cling to it deliberately, ensuring the entire audience saw exactly who held the absolute power in this dynamic. I stood tall, letting his weakness contrast sharply against my unyielding strength. "You own my debt now," Julian sobbed, his hot tears dropping onto the toes of my designer shoes. "Please do not call in the markers. I will do anything you want. I will work for you. I will pay you back every single cent. Just give me a payment plan. Give me a chance to make this right. Do not destroy me, Chloe. I am begging you. Do not take my life away." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the desperate, ragged sound of Julian inhaling air. The hundreds of influential guests waited, holding their collective breath to see if the ruthless crisis manager would show even a single ounce of mercy to the man she was supposed to marry. They wondered if the sight of her broken, weeping fiancé would soften her resolve and prompt a moment of grace. I looked down at Julian. I felt absolutely no pity, no lingering affection, and certainly no mercy. He had locked me in a dining room, threatened to ruin my business, stolen my cash, and tried to extort my home. He had awakened the predator inside me, and predators do not negotiate with their prey once the jaws are permanently locked. I had spent my life building a fortress, and he had tried to burn it down. My expression remained a mask of absolute chilling indifference. I looked at him with zero emotion, my eyes as cold and unforgiving as a deep winter storm. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, ensuring my final words were captured flawlessly by the microphone for the entire room to hear. I told you at dinner, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. The answer is no. I deliberately pulled the hem of my red silk gown out of his desperate, clutching hands. I took one smooth, elegant step backward, completely removing myself from his grasp. Deprived of the only thing keeping him upright, Julian lost his balance entirely. His hands fell heavily to the hard wooden floor of the stage. He collapsed forward, his forehead resting against the ground, sobbing uncontrollably into the dark, empty space. I did not look back at him. I simply turned on my heel and walked gracefully off the stage, leaving the completely broken dynasty to wallow in the spectacular ruins of their own making. It has been exactly 6 months since that unforgettable night at the Buckhead Country Club. I am currently standing on the sprawling glass balcony of my $2 million penthouse. The early morning Atlanta sun is warming my face, and I am sipping a perfectly brewed cup of black coffee. The city skyline stretches out before me, representing a landscape of endless beautiful possibilities. The view from up here is absolutely spectacular, especially when you know you own the very ground beneath it. The fallout from the rehearsal dinner was swift, brutal, and entirely comprehensive. Julian officially declared bankruptcy less than 3 weeks after the country club incident. Without the protective shield of his family name and their financial resources, he was completely exposed to the harsh reality of the legal system. The federal authorities and the state prosecutors did not show him a single ounce of mercy. He is currently facing multiple federal embezzlement charges for draining his family accounts. Furthermore, the underground gambling syndicates ensure he sleeps with one eye open every single night. His charming, polished executive facade has completely evaporated, leaving behind a broken, desperate man facing a very long prison sentence. Jeremiah fared no better in the aftermath. The great patriarch who boldly demanded my absolute submission watched helplessly as my blind limited liability company systematically liquidated his entire real estate empire. The massive commercial towers bearing his prestigious family name were stripped and sold off at public auction to satisfy the massive debts he owed me. His mega-church congregation forced him to resign in absolute disgrace once the full extent of his financial corruption became public knowledge. The arrogant man who built his entire identity on patriarchal dominance was left with absolutely nothing to rule over. Terrence was immediately denied bail. The high-definition security footage and digital evidence of his corporate espionage were far too overwhelming for any defense attorney to overcome. He pleaded guilty to grand larceny and corporate fraud, hoping for a reduced sentence, but the judge decided to make a severe example of him. He is currently serving hard time in a federal penitentiary. Sienna swiftly filed for divorce shortly after his sentencing, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny scrap of social standing she had left in the city. And then there is Vivian. The grand matriarch of Atlanta elite society suffered the most poetic downfall of them all. Stripped of her sprawling Buckhead mansion, her designer silk gowns, and her exclusive country club memberships, she was forced to move into a tiny, cramped, rented apartment on the distant outskirts of the city. The wealthy socialites and influential alumni boards she once fiercely controlled completely shunned her. Her phone permanently stopped ringing. The exclusive charity gala invitations stopped arriving entirely. She is entirely isolated, permanently exiled from the high society circles she worshipped more than her own soul. While their toxic dynasty burned to the ground, my professional empire experienced a breathtaking meteoric rise. My crisis management and public relations firm saw a staggering 400% increase in gross revenue over the last 2 fiscal quarters. The corporate world in Atlanta and beyond watched me surgically dismantle a powerful, deeply entrenched family in a single night. The influential executives, politicians, and power brokers realized a fundamental, undeniable truth. If I possess the strategic brilliance and absolute ruthlessness to completely annihilate a corrupt dynasty over a dinner service, I was exactly the kind of apex predator they desperately wanted on their own payroll. My client waiting list is now miles long. I command premium retainers and dictate my own terms in every single boardroom I enter. I no longer have to politely tolerate arrogant men who underestimate my self-made background. My fierce reputation precedes me, ensuring that no one ever attempts to diminish my worth or question my authority again. I am richer than I have ever been. I am professionally untouchable, and most importantly, I am completely and utterly at peace. I look out over the vibrant city, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The morning air feels noticeably cleaner now. The heavy toxic weight of trying to fit into a suffocating mold created by deeply flawed people is entirely gone. I built my beautiful sanctuary with my own two hands, and I successfully defended it against the predators who tried to steal my hard-earned crown. People often think loyalty means setting yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. We are heavily conditioned to endure blatant disrespect, manipulation, and severe financial abuse, simply because it comes from people who claim to love us. We are taught to protect the fragile family legacy, even when that legacy is actively destroying our own mental peace. But true power is realizing you do not have to participate in your own destruction. True power is confidently walking away from the match and letting them burn in the fires they started entirely by themselves. If someone ever tries to hand you a pen to sign away your hard-earned worth, whether it is a manipulative romantic partner, a demanding parent, or an arrogant in-law, make absolutely sure you hand them a receipt instead. Never shrink your brilliant, authentic self to accommodate the fragile egos of people who boldly refuse to grow. Your financial independence, your soaring success, and your absolute peace of mind are strictly non-negotiable assets. Protect them fiercely and never apologize for surviving. Have you ever had to legally dismantle someone who tried to ruin your life? Have you ever had to boldly stand up to a toxic family and firmly take back your power? Let me know your unique stories in the comments below. Stay remarkably strong, trust your sharp instincts, and always keep all your receipts ready.